Welcome back to the NWR Virtual Healthcare Conference. Our last presentation for the 2025 iteration is from Neurotech International, ASX code NTI, and we're joined by the CEO and Managing Director, Anthony Philippus, who started with the company in February this year. Neurotech International is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical development company focused predominantly on pediatric neurological disorders with a broad spectrum oral cannabinoid drug therapy known as NTI 164. Without any further ado, I'll throw over to Anthony for his presentation.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for logging in to listen to the Neurotech story. What I'd like to do over the next 20-25 minutes or so is to walk you through the story and the strategy that we have for the company and really demonstrate how we are working to advance neuroscience and transform the lives of those with neurological disorders. As I'm very safe to say with this audience, all of us have been impacted in some way by neurological disorders, whether it be through family, friends, or those in the community. What I'd also like to do is to introduce you to our refined strategy as we embark on a path towards partnering and commercialization. Neurotech is a clinical stage biotech company, and NTI 164 is our lead therapy. It's an orally available cannabinoid therapy for the treatment of neurological disorders. Specifically, we are looking at autism spectrum disorder, Rett syndrome, and a rare neuropsychiatric syndrome, PANS-PANDAS. We have a substantial opportunity with NTI 164. Epidiolex is the only FDA-approved therapy that is a cannabinoid therapy. At the end of the year 2024, they generated sales of $972 million. We also have a highly experienced board and management team of advisors, and we also are well funded with around about $6 million as at the end of 31 December 2024. And we also received an R&D tax incentive to the value of around about $2.44 million in January of 2025. What I'd like to share with you today is really how we are going to pivot the company towards commercial success. And I'll run through some of the clinical data as well as some of the commercial data that we will be looking to implement moving forward. So what does our pipeline comprise of? Well, it comprises of clinical programs in neurological and rare neurological disorders of children where neuroinflammation is involved. Again, keep in mind that NTI 164 targets neuroinflammation in these disorders. So our pipeline comprises of a phase 2/3 program in autism spectrum disorder, phase 1/2 data in PANS-PANDAS, and again, in a rare neurological disorder known as Rett syndrome, we also have phase 1/2 clinical data. For Rett syndrome, we also have US FDA orphan drug designation, and we recently in February announced to the market that we also received a positive opinion from the EMA on our orphan drug status in Europe. This is a very detailed slide. I won't go through this in detail, obviously, but just to demonstrate that we are dealing with very, very large markets with a clear unmet medical need. Just to touch on autism spectrum disorder, President Trump only a few weeks ago in his speech to Congress mentioned that in the 60s, there was around about 1 in 10,000 children that were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Turn the clock forward and we now have 1 in 36 children. So we are dealing with disorders where there is a large market need and obviously a real role here for NTI 164 in treating these disorders. So what is NTI 164? NTI 164 is a cannabinoid-derived therapy. It's a proprietary formulation with a novel combination of cannabinoids. We have patents over composition, use, and formulations, and it's designed to target neuroinflammation by suppressing a wide range of inflammatory cytokines and improving neuronal viability. We directly address the underlying causes of the disease, not just the symptoms of the neurological disorders that we're treating. It's a very safe and effective drug, as we've shown in our studies, and we believe that it has an excellent excellent safety profile and that it will be a transformative breakthrough therapy in rare neurological disorders. NTI 164 has shown compelling evidence of clinical efficacy across all of our indications. We have completed 4 clinical studies, and we have basically demonstrated an improvement using CGI-I scores and also looked at the severity of illness, looking at CGI-S scores across all of our indications. If we look at our ASD Harmony phase 2/3 study, we saw an improvement of 84% in patients by about week 20 of our clinical study. In patients with Rett syndrome, we saw a 93% improvement in patients at week 12 of our clinical study. And in PANS-PANDAS, in our phase 1/2 clinical study, we saw improvement of around about 87% in patients by about week 24 of our clinical study. Together with this, when we looked at our CGI-S scores, we saw a decrease in the severity of the illness over time. So not only are we improving patients' symptoms across all of our indications, but we're also reducing the severity of illness. So these are very impressive CGI-I and CGI-S scores, and pharma companies really like strong CGI and CGI-S scores. So we believe that NTI 164 is a highly attractive opportunity for partnering. So I talked at the beginning of the presentation about pivoting towards commercial success. So what does that look like? What is our commercialization strategy and our strategy to grow shareholder value? Well, if we look at the Australian market, we'll be looking at the TGA. We are in discussions with the TGA. We have open dialogue there, and we are looking at a provisional determination in Rett syndrome. We're looking at that provisional determination around the end of this year, early next year, with a TGA approval in Rett syndrome slated for 2026, towards the end of 2026. We are then looking at potentially generating our first revenues in Australia in the calendar year 2027. In the US, we are looking at an IND strategy. Therefore, we need to submit an IND in Rett syndrome and also in autism spectrum disorder. And we plan to do that in the second half, probably early in the second half of this year, with an IND approval in Rett syndrome and autism spectrum disorder slated for the end of this year. By having an open IND, we will then be able to pursue development and partnering strategy for both indications in the US. We're fortunate in that we already have an orphan drug designation by the US FDA in the US for Rett syndrome. So again, I talk about an IND submission, and investors always ask, well, what does that actually mean? So in general, an IND submission, especially for an Australian company, you need to submit your IND application. And what happens is that once you've submitted that, the FDA will then look at all of your clinical data. They'll look at your chemistry, your manufacturing, your controls, your preclinical data, and they will basically review that data and provide you with feedback. What generally happens from there is that if you're fortunate enough to move forward to an approval, you obtain the approval, and then you're open to do clinical studies in the US. And obviously, from our perspective, not only does it open up a development strategy in the US, but it also opens up a partnering strategy in the US, which is vitally important as we progress down the commercialization path for NTI 164. Turning our attention to the competitive landscape in the areas that we're working in, if I could just focus your attention to the approved column, you can see that there are only a few drugs that have been approved across all the indications that we are working in. If we look at autism spectrum disorder, there are a number of companies developing drugs in early development and in late development, and we are one of those in late development. But if you look at the approved drugs, there are only 2 approved drugs for autism spectrum disorder, risperidone and aripiprazole. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these drugs or therapies were originally approved for schizophrenia. They have now been recently, when I say recently, in late 2000s, approved only for comorbid symptoms in patients with autism spectrum disorder that demonstrate irritability and aggression. and they need to be over the years of 5 and 6 years of age. In Rett syndrome, there's only one approved therapy, that is Daybue from Acadia. And again, Daybue, the pricing for Daybue is around about $350,000 per year of therapy. And just at the end of last year, they're generating $350 million of revenue. So again, there's a real opportunity in Rett syndrome with only one FDA-approved therapy on the market. If we look at PANS and PANDAS, it's a very emerging therapy with a very strong patient advocacy group. And again, there are no approved drugs in this space. So again, Neurotech is ahead of the curve in recognizing this devastating disorder. And there is one company, Octapharma, that is developing IVIG to look at PANS PANDAS. So again, if you look across all of our indications, there are only a handful of drugs that have been approved. So it's not a crowded space when we're looking at developing NTI-164 in these indications. If we turn our attention to the commercial opportunity for NTI-164, we've done some preliminary work internally around what is the commercial opportunity for NTI-164. We've looked at comparative revenues, and obviously I've already explained that Epidiolex, the only FDA-approved cannabinoid therapy, is selling at around about $1 billion a year. And you can see how they've progressed over the last few years to that $1 billion in revenue. Daybue is generating about $350 million in revenue, and the price points for those therapies are around about $33,000 for Epidiolex and $350,000 for Daybue. So we've done some very conservative, very early preliminary pricing estimates. And if we look and really look at the commercial opportunity ahead of us and assume that we penetrate only about 1% of the market, the total addressable market that our drug is being indicated for, and we assume a price point of around about $28,000 per year, we're looking at a greater than $10 billion market opportunity for NTI-164 moving forward. So again, we have a real opportunity here with NTI-164. If we look at some of the market comparators, this is further emphasized when we look at some of the companies that are developing drugs in very similar indications to us. If I just turn your attention to Anavex, Anavex is a company that's developing a drug for autism spectrum disorder in phase 2/3. It also developed a drug for Rett syndrome in phase 2/3. That drug failed in January of 2024 to meet its primary endpoint, but it has a market cap of $790 million. If we look at Taysha Therapeutics, they have a phase 1/2 program for Rett syndrome, and Neurogene have a phase 1/2 program for Rett syndrome and Batten disease, other neurological disorders. And you can see that they have market caps respectively of $350 million and $235 million. If we then look at Neurotech and NTI-164, we have compelling clinical data in autism spectrum disorder at phase 2/3. We have phase 1/2 data in Rett syndrome and phase 1/2 data in PANDAS PANS. And we are valued at $39 million Australian. So I'll leave it to you to make what you will of that as investors. But from a company perspective, we believe that we are undervalued compared to these peers. So I spoke about partnering and the emphasis on partnering and the fact that we really want to move forward with our commercialization plans and partnering plans. Well, what does a commercialization partnering deal look like? Well, in our industry, it very much looks like a licensing transaction. So what is the typical structure of a transaction? Investors ask me all the time. Well, it really falls into 3 buckets. So you have an upfront payment, a milestone payment, and a royalty payment. Upfront payments are generally payments that are made at the time of signing the deal. These are generally not at risk, and sometimes they do include an equity component. Milestone payments are payments that are made during the partnership. So they're usually linked to predefined milestones. If you meet those milestones, you receive a milestone payment. If you don't receive a milestone payment. Royalties are often the greatest source of economic value in the transaction and generally depend on the successful commercialization and sales of the product. This is where it becomes really lucrative for a company and where they make the majority of their money. If you flip to the other side of the slide, what I've prepared here is some benchmarks for phase 2-3 neuro partnering transactions. So again, phase 2-3, keep that in mind. That's exactly where NTI 164 currently sits. So if you look at median deals in this space, upfront, we're looking at around about $40 million. Milestone payments, we're looking at around about $467 million with a royalty of around about 9%. So again, we're looking at quite substantial deal values when it comes to partnering and licensing of assets such as NTI 164. One thing I'd like to just mention quickly and focus on is that it's not always all about the financial terms of the transaction. It's obviously very important, but it's not the be all and end all of a deal. I think the most important part of the deal is actually doing a deal with a partner that has the capability and the commitment to develop and commercialize your drug. Because otherwise, all you will ever see in a deal is the upfront payment. You won't see any of the milestones or the royalties. So I think some of those, deals that I've mentioned, around 40 million upfront, 467 million in milestones with a 9% royalty, are really well reflected when we look at benchmark transactions, which really suggest a significant value potential for NTI 164. When we look at licensing transactions, again, in our indication areas of neurological disorders, and maybe we can just pick a couple off this slide, ABVC Biopharma, for example, with AIBTL Biopharma, again, for ADHD and depression, a neurological disorder, phase 2 drug, $667 million total licensing deal. If we look at Acadia, again, with Saniona for essential tremor, again, another neurological disorder, this one only in phase 1, $582 million. So again, the opportunity here for NTI 164 is quite enormous, and we believe that there is a real potential as we move towards partnering for our drug to be as successful as some of these deals that have taken place in the market over recent years. I've thrown in a few examples on M&A. And one thing I can definitely tell you is that when a company is looking at you from a partnering perspective and a licensing perspective, they will always be looking at you from an M&A perspective. They may not do an M&A deal, but they will definitely look at you from an M&A perspective. And there are really two relevant examples here that are both actually cannabinoid drugs. So Pfizer acquired Arena Therapeutics when they had their drug Orelindab at phase 2 for $6.7 billion. And Jazz Pharmaceuticals, which I've just obviously mentioned to you, acquired GW Pharma for Epidiolex primarily for $7.2 billion. So there is really some significant value potential here as we move NTI 164 towards commercialization. I won't focus on this slide too much, but just to demonstrate that we have a board that brings extensive international experience across drug development, finance, and commercialization. And we have a clinical advisory and COAL committee, which provides extensive expertise in clinical development. We have Professor Carolyn Allaway, who is our PI for our Rett syndrome clinical trials, Professor Michael Fay, who is our PI for our autism spectrum disorder clinical trials, and Professor Russell Dale, who is our PI for our PANDAS clinical trials. We also have Professor Jennifer Frankovich and Dr. Terence Thomas, respectively from Stanford in the US and Singapore General Hospital, who provide general advice in general pediatrics and neuroimmunology. So just to touch on, and I've already mentioned our market cap, but just to touch on our financial position. Again, our market cap is around about $39 million today. We have our top 40 shareholders that hold around about 59% of the shares, and we're currently sitting at about 3.7 cents a share. So again, we believe that we have some really important value drivers that can re-rate us in the market in the near and medium term. And we believe that not only have we demonstrated today that we have a huge market potential and that we address high growth neurological markets, but we have proven science with validated clinical programs. So we believe that with a clear commercial strategy, as I've demonstrated today, which revolves around the Australian market and TGA approval and an IND strategy for getting into the US, really puts us in a very strong position for future growth. And we've got a very good team of collaborators, including regulatory and clinical collaborators, that will help us execute and drive that vision forward. So just to touch on some of the value-driving catalysts on the horizon for Neurotech, I won't go through these in detail. We've already ticked off on some of those, I'm glad to say, in the first quarter of this year. But if we look at just some of the things that are happening in the first half of this year, we will look to complete our human phase 1 PK study in the first half of this year. And also we'll be looking at completing our GLP tox in the first half of this year. If we turn forward to the second half of the year, as I've already mentioned, we're really excited about our IND submissions and approvals that will come towards the end of this year. So that's enough from me about why I believe NTI-164 and Neurotech has a successful future. But what are the families and clinicians saying about NTI-164? Let's not lose focus of the fact that what we're here for really is developing therapies for patients and their families. So I won't touch on all of these, but just to read through a few, from 20 meltdowns a day to maybe one. He's going to school camp for the first time ever. She's deliberately using her eyes to tell us what she wants now. It's not just looking, it's intentional and purposeful. Let's let that sink in for a moment. These are patients and their families that have been on NTI-164 and are seeing real benefits and an impact in their lives. I won't quote all the clinicians, but just to quote Professor Carolyn Allaway, in my view, results obtained with NTI-164 are truly remarkable and unprecedented. My team and I are excited to be part of this life-changing program. In closing, I'd just like to thank you all for your attention. I'd like to thank NWR for the opportunity to present the company to you today and our new strategy. And I welcome everybody on the call who's interested in NTI-164 and in Neurotech as a company to join us on our journey. Thank you, Matt. I'll hand over to you for questions.
Great. Thanks, Anthony, for your presentation. We've got time for a few questions, so I'll just jump right into those. In your presentation, you mentioned that you'll be looking to partner NTI-164 in the US. Can you elaborate on the type of partner that you would be targeting?
Absolutely. The type of partner that we'll be targeting will be a partner that has, I believe, the commercial engine and the capability to drive our drug forward towards market. Ultimately, we need a company that has already probably had a drug on the market approved, a company that's probably looking to fill its pipeline with a drug like ours. And that really means that it would be either a big biotech, pharma, or maybe even a specialty pharma company that has a focus in rare neurology or neurology in general.
Thank you. The next question I have is, how important are patient advocacy groups in the commercialisation of NTI-164?
Now that's a good question. Look, they're vitally important. I think that patient advocacy is critical to any commercialisation plan as you move a drug forward towards approval and towards market. Patient advocates that really have an impact and understand your drug. As I showed in the previous slide around families and clinicians, this is a drug that's having real impact on patients. So having patient advocates that understand, learn about our drug and the benefits of our drug will hold us in really good stead as we move towards commercialization. Keep in mind that patient advocacy groups that really understand and support what you're trying to do can be your best advocates when lobbying to government and regulators. So they will be a really important component of our commercialization plans moving forward.
Thank you. And just I've got one final one. Do you foresee Neurotech moving into any other neurological condition?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is not yet. We are laser focused on commercializing NTI 164 for the neurological disorders where we have compelling clinical data and evidence of efficacy. We want to do this because we really want to try and get the drug to patients as soon as possible. I think I've demonstrated throughout the presentation how valuable this drug is, and I think that's what we're trying to do. We want to try and get it to patients as quickly as possible. We also want to generate value for our shareholders, for our long-term holders, for our new holders. We want to really demonstrate that we can get this drug as close to market as possible in the near future. So once we've successfully done that, then I think we may consider some other indications. But for now, we're focused on our commercialization path.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your presentation today, Anthony, and for taking those questions. And we'll look forward to hearing more from you soon.
No, thank you, Matt. Thanks again. And thanks to everybody for listening in. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Anthony. And I'll just take the time, as I mentioned at the start, given this is our last presentation. Thanks to everyone who's joined both this presentation and over the last couple of days. If there's anything that you missed, be it a company presentation or the investment panel session earlier today, they're all, most of them are already on our YouTube channel. The more recent ones, like this one, is about to go on our YouTube channel. Thanks again to Mark at BioShares for helping out with the event. If you have any interest in the sector, I encourage you to try and go to their conference, which is on the 7th and 8th of August in Hobart this year. Thanks also to Vertical Events, who assisted us in marketing the conference over the last couple of days. And if there's any further questions on any of the companies, please feel free to get in touch with myself or with them directly. But thanks again to everyone for your time.